One of Sydney's worst mass murders.
Sydney's most horrific murders.
Reporters heard Robert Z shared dinner with the Lin family hours before he allegedly murdered.
On the night of July 17, 2009, Min Lin turned off the lights of his news agency, locked the door, and drove home to his family in North Epping, Sydney. The same way he had done 1,000 times before. He had dinner plans with relatives, a business to open in the morning, and 3 children who needed him. He had no idea that someone he trusted completely was already rehearsing, in his mind, exactly how the night would end. By sunrise, Min would be gone. So would his wife. So would her sister. So would his 2 young boys. And the man who did it would be sitting at the breakfast table preparing to comfort the only child left alive. The world of Min Lin. His full name was Min Lin. He was 39 years old, a father of 3, a husband, a son, and a self-made businessman who had built something remarkable from almost nothing in a country that was not his birthplace. He lived at Boundary Road, North Epping, a quiet, leafy suburb on the upper north shore of Sydney. The kind of neighborhood where children ride bicycles on Sunday mornings and neighbors wave from their driveways. It was, by every visible measure, a place where nothing terrible was supposed to happen. Min was born in China and came to Australia as a young man pursuing higher education. He was sharp, ambitious, and quietly determined. The kind of person who did not speak loudly about his dreams, but worked toward them with a discipline that few could match. He met his wife, Yun Lin, during their university years. She was 2 years his junior, also Chinese-born, also navigating a foreign country with courage and hope. And their connection was immediate. Friends who knew them in those early years described it as the kind of love that anchors people, steady, unshowy, and real. They married and settled in North Epping, building their life brick by brick. Min was focused and entrepreneurial. What began as a modest newsstand gradually transformed, under his careful management, into a thriving news agency and publishing operation on Rouse Street. The business was generating close to $1 million annually by the mid-2000s, an extraordinary achievement for a migrant family that had arrived with little more than ambition and each other. But Min was not defined by money. Those who knew him described a man who was generous almost to a fault. He helped relatives emigrate from China. He employed family members. He bought a home for his in-laws. He was the gravitational center of an extended family that had slowly reassembled itself around him in Australia. Because Min Lin was the kind of man people wanted to be near. The family he built. Min and Yun's home on Boundary Road was full of life. They had 3 children. Their eldest, Brenda, formerly June Brenda Lin, was born in August 1994. She was 15 at the time of the tragedy, a standout student, and a compassionate, animal-loving teenager who carried her parents' discipline and her own quiet grace. Their son Henry was born in 1997, energetic, sports-obsessed, passionate about soccer in the way only a 12-year-old boy can be. Their youngest, Terry, born in 2000, was just 9 years old. He shared his brother's love of the game and his father's easy smile. Also living in the household was Irene, Yun's younger sister, who had come from China to help with the children and the home. She was warm, devoted to her nephews and niece, and deeply embedded in the fabric of daily family life. She was not a visitor, she was home. Yun herself was the emotional core of the household. While Min managed the business with precision, Yun dedicated herself to her children with a ferocity and tenderness that defined her. She cooked elaborate meals, attended every school event, and maintained a home that neighbors described as always open, always welcoming. She laughed easily. She worried constantly, the way mothers do when they love without reservation. The Lin family was, by every account from neighbors, friends, and community members, a model of what it looked like to build a good life through hard work and love. They were respected in the local Chinese-Australian community. They donated to causes. They never quarreled publicly. They were known simply as good people, the extended family. As their prosperity grew, Min and Yun began sponsoring relatives to come to Australia. Min's parents were among the first, settling nearby in North Epping and helping with the grandchildren. Yun's parents followed, with Min and Yun purchasing a small house for them. The family was not merely a household. It was a compound of affection, responsibility, and shared history. In late 2007, Min's younger sister Kathy Lynn arrived in Sydney with her husband. She was cheerful, hard-working, and fiercely proud of her brother's success. Her husband came with her, a man who smiled easily in photographs, who spoke confidently about his former career as a doctor in China, and who carried himself with the quiet authority of someone who believed he deserved more than life had given him. His name was Robert C. Min welcomed Robert into the family the way he welcomed everyone, openly, generously, and without suspicion. He gave Robert and Kathy time to settle. He offered financial support when their restaurant venture failed. He gave Robert access to the family home. He even gave Robert a key. He trusted him completely. The last ordinary evening. On the evening of Friday, July 17, 2009, the extended Lin family gathered for dinner at the home of Min and Kathy's parents. The kind of warm, noisy, multi-generational meal that had become a ritual of their Australian life. Grandparents, aunts, uncles, children, food on every surface, the sound of Mandarin and laughter filling the room. No one at that table knew it was the last time they would all be together. Brenda was not present that evening. She had left the day before on a school trip to New Caledonia, a Pacific Island excursion organized by her school that she had been looking forward to for weeks. Her bags were already packed. Her bedroom at home sat quiet and empty. After dinner, Min drove his family back to Boundary Road. The children went to bed. Yun tidied the kitchen. Irene retired to her room. Min, exhausted from another long week at the agency, went to sleep. Somewhere that same night, in a house not far away, someone else was also preparing. Not for sleep, for something else entirely. The lights on Boundary Road went dark. Barandand, and then they never came back on. There is a particular kind of dangerous person that society struggles to identify, not because they hide in shadows, but because they stand in full light, smiling, shaking hands, sitting at your dinner table, accepting your generosity, and planning, in the quietest corner of their mind, exactly how to take everything you have built. Robert Tsai was that kind of person. He did not look like a monster. He looked like a brother-in-law. He looked like a guest. He looked, to everyone who knew him, like a man simply trying to find his footing in a new country. That was the mask, and he wore it with extraordinary patience for years, until the night he finally took it off. Origins: the man from China. Robert C. was born in China, where he pursued and obtained a medical degree qualifying as an ear, a nose and throat specialist. A career path that demanded years of discipline, academic rigor, and professional credibility. On paper, he was impressive. In conversation, he projected the quiet confidence of someone who had earned his place in the world through intellect and hard work. But the reality beneath that surface told a different story. According to evidence that emerged during the investigation and subsequent trial, Robert had never truly established a stable, successful career in medicine in China. Rumors, ones that investigators took seriously, suggested he had fled China not for opportunity, as he claimed, but to escape consequences. Specifically, allegations of bribery had reportedly shadowed his professional life back home. Whether those allegations were ever formally pursued in China remains unclear. But the pattern they suggested, a man willing to cut ethical corners when personal gain was at stake, would prove deeply relevant. Robert and his wife Kathy, Min Lin's younger sister, had visited Australia before, briefly living in Melbourne before returning to China. But by late 2007, they made the decision to relocate permanently to Sydney, drawn by family, by opportunity, and, in Robert's case, by proximity to something he had been watching from a distance with growing intensity: the success of his brother-in-law, Min Lin. Arrival in Australia, the failing man. From the moment Robert arrived in Sydney, he struggled. And struggle, for a man of his particular ego and self-image, his insecure, was not merely inconvenient, it was humiliating. His first venture was a restaurant in Sydney, funded by what remained of his and Kathy's savings. It failed. Okay, a subsequent attempt to open a cafe or snack bar also collapsed. Robert, despite his medical credentials and his confident manner, lacked the practical instincts required for small business success. He did not understand cash flow. He did not understand the Australian market. He did not understand or refuse to accept that credentials from another country and another life did not automatically translate into prosperity in a new one. After these failures, Robert and Kathy moved to North Epping, closer to family, closer to Min. And it was here that Robert's downward spiral became most visible to those paying attention. He stopped working. He became, by all accounts, essentially idle, relying on Kathy's income and on occasional financial assistance from her relatives. Hain, the man who had once introduced himself as a successful ENT doctor, was now a dependent, unemployed, and increasingly bitter presence in a household that his wife was holding together largely on her own. The psychology of envy. Investigators and psychologists who later examined Robert's profile identified a man consumed by envy. Not the passing kind that most people experience and move beyond, but a festering, obsessive variety that had curdled over years into something far more dangerous. Every day in North Epping was a reminder of what he was not. Min Lin woke up and ran a business worth nearly $1 million a year. Min Lin owned a spacious family home. Min Lin drove a luxury car. Min Lin sent his children to prestigious private schools. Min Lin was respected. Min Lin was loved. Min Lin had built, in with his own hands and his wife's partnership, exactly the kind of life that Robert believed he deserved and had failed to create. Robert watched all of it. He ate at Min's table. He accepted Min's generosity. He smiled at Min's children. And somewhere behind that smile, according to the confession he would later make to prison informants, he was building a plan. The plan was not impulsive. It was not born of a single moment of rage. Investigators concluded, and the evidence strongly suggested, that Robert had been meticulously planning the murders for an extended period, studying the household's routines, mapping the layout of the home he had been welcomed into, identifying the right moment, acquiring the right tools, and waiting with a patience that, in retrospect, is among the most chilling aspects of the entire case. The key at some point, before July 2009, Min Lin gave Robert a key to the family home on Boundary Road. It was a gesture of trust, the kind of uncomplicated, generous act that defined how Min moved through the world. He wanted his brother-in-law to have access in case of emergency. Robert accepted the key and said nothing about it to anyone. Not to Kathy, not to investigators when he was later questioned. It was Brenda, the surviving daughter, who would eventually reveal this detail to police, unwittingly handing them one of the most important pieces of the puzzle. Robert also knew the house intimately. He had visited dozens of times. He knew where the bedrooms were. He knew the layout of the second floor. He knew, critically, where the electrical panel was located, a detail that would become significant on the night of the murders. He knew when the power to the house was cut entirely before the attack began. Moving through a house in complete darkness, knowing exactly where to go, requires either extraordinary luck or prior knowledge. Robert had neither luck nor chance on his side that night. He had information. The weeks before. In the weeks leading up to July 18, 2009, Robert's behavior showed no outward signs of alarm to those around him. He attended family gatherings. He sat through dinners. He interacted with Min's children, Henry, Terry, and Brenda, in the way a familiar uncle does. He was present at the final family gathering on the evening of July 17th, at the home of Min and Kathy's parents. He ate, he talked, he said goodnight. What no one at that table knew was that Robert had already purchased the weapon. According to his later confession to prison cellmates, he had acquired a hammer from a remote store specifically chosen because it lacked surveillance cameras. He had gloves. He had a plan for disposing of everything afterward. He had chillingly also ensured that his wife Kathy would not wake up during his absence that night, allegedly administering sedatives in her tea before leaving the house. He had thought of everything, almost everything. One small detail, one single overlooked moment, would eventually unravel the entire architecture of his escape. But that unraveling would take years. And before it came, 5 people who trusted him completely would pay the highest price imaginable. The house on Boundary Road was dark, the family was asleep, and Robert C. was already on his way. There are nights that split time in two, nights that divide a family's story into before and after, into warmth and devastation, into everything that was and everything that will never be again. For the Lynn family of North Epping, Sydney, that night was July 17th into the early hours of July 18th, 2009. It began as an ordinary Friday evening. It ended as the scene of one of the most brutal and heartbreaking mass murders in Australian history. And at the center of it, moving through a darkened house he knew by memory, past bedrooms where children slept, past doors he had opened 100 times as a welcome guest, was a man the family called family. Friday evening. The last gathering. The Lynn extended family had spent the evening of July 17th together at the home of Min and Kathy's parents. A warm, familiar gathering of the kind that had become a cornerstone of their shared life in Australia. There was food, conversation, the comfortable noise of a large Chinese-Australian family at ease with one another. Grandparents sat with grandchildren. Adults talked over tea. The evening carried the ordinary texture of belonging. Min Lin was present, so was Yun. So was Irene, Yun's sister, who had made the Lin household her home. Henry and Terry, the boys, were there, full of the restless energy of children who have eaten well and stayed up slightly past their usual hour. Robert C. was there too, seated among them, participating in the conversation, playing the role he had played for years, with practiced ease. Brenda, the eldest child, was absent. She had departed the previous day on a school excursion to New Caledonia, a Pacific Island trip organized through her school that she had been anticipating for weeks. Her bedroom at Boundary Road sat empty. That emptiness, as it would turn out, saved her life. After the gathering ended, the family said their goodnights. Min drove Yun, Irene, Henry, and Terry back to the house on Boundary Road. The children were put to bed. Yun and Irene retired. Min, who had been running his news agency 6 and 7 days a week for years, went to sleep with the uncomplicated fatigue of a man who had earned his rest. Robert and Kathy returned to their own home nearby. And then, according to the account Robert would later give to prison informants, he prepared. He allegedly laced Kathy's evening tea with sedatives, enough to ensure she would sleep deeply and not notice his absence. He gathered what he needed. He waited until the house was still. And then, he left. After midnight, the attack begins. Investigators established the time of the attack as somewhere between midnight and 3 a.m. on July 18, 2009. Robert Tsai, using the key Min had given him in trust, entered the house on Boundary Road without forcing a single door or breaking a single window. The house showed no signs of forced entry because none was required. He walked in as if he belonged there, because in every way that Min had intended, he did. Before moving through the house, Robert located the electrical panel and cut the power entirely. The house went dark, completely, silently dark. He knew where the panel was because he had been inside that home dozens of times. He knew the layout of every room. He knew which door led where. In total darkness, he did not need to see. He only needed to remember. He was wearing gloves. He was carrying a hammer. Forensic evidence and the reconstructed timeline suggested that Min Lin was the first to die. He was struck multiple times in the head while he slept. A series of devastating blows that left the room saturated in blood. The walls, the ceiling, the floor, the furniture. Every surface bore witness to the violence that had been brought into this home, under cover of darkness and trust. The horror spreads from Min's room. Robert moved through the house with methodical purpose. Yun Lin was killed next, beaten with the same ferocity. Her body found near the bed, mutilated. According to first responders, beyond immediate recognition, the room was drenched. There was no sign that she had been able to call out or flee. Irene, sleeping in the adjacent room, was killed in her bed. Her face, investigators would note in their reports, had been beaten beyond recognition. She had come to Australia to be close to her sister. She had built her life inside the warmth of the Lin family. She died in her sleep, in what should have been the safest place she knew. The boys were last. Henry was 12 years old. Terry was 9. Forensic evidence told investigators something that has haunted everyone connected to this case since the moment it was understood. The children were awake. Bloodstains and smear patterns found throughout the upstairs hallway and across multiple surfaces indicated that Henry and Terry had woken during the attack, had realized something was terribly wrong, and had tried to run. They did not make it far. Their bodies were found in different corners of their shared room, beaten to death in the same manner as their parents. Every adult victim also showed evidence of strangulation, applied, investigators concluded, to subdue resistance and minimize noise during the assault. The killer had thought about noise. He had thought about resistance. He had planned for both. The deliberate detail. Among the most chilling pieces of evidence gathered at the crime scene was this. Bloody glove prints were found on the door handles of every bedroom where a murder had occurred. The killer had touched each door with bloodied hands, opening, entering, and closing as he moved from room to room. But the door handle of Brenda's bedroom was clean, untouched. The killer had not approached it. He had not reached for it. He already knew she was not there. He had been at the family dinner. He had watched. He had listened. He had filed that information away and used it on the night he came to kill. The weapon, the hammer, was never found. Robert had disposed of it in a manner he later described in prison as carefully planned. His gloves, his clothing, and his shoes were similarly disposed of. He left no fingerprints. He left no foreign DNA. He left only the blood of 5 people and a single set of shoe prints, size 9.5, with a distinctive ornate tread pattern, repeated across every room where someone had died. He walked out the way he came in. The front door closed behind him. The house on Boundary Road was silent. Saturday morning. The discovery. The Lin Family News Agency did not open on the morning of Saturday, July 18, 2009. It had never, in years of operation, closed without notice. Regular customers arrived and found the shutters down. No sign on the door. No explanation. Neighboring shopkeepers tried calling Min. No answer. One of them, increasingly concerned, called Kathy, Robert's wife and Min's sister, to ask if everything was all right. Kathy was surprised, alarmed. She called Min's mobile phone. No answer. She called Yun's phone. No answer. She called the house phone. Silence. Kathy and Robert drove to Boundary Road together, arriving around 9 a.m. The family car was in the driveway. The front door was unlocked. They called out. No one answered. Robert waited downstairs while Kathy ascended to the second floor. She opened the door to Min and Yun's bedroom. What she saw caused her to scream, a sound described by those who heard it as something beyond ordinary human distress, a sound torn from somewhere deeper than language. She staggered backward into the hallway, unable to process what her eyes were showing her. She called emergency services. Her words came out fractured, interrupted by sobs and screams. The operator struggled to understand her, and then, at the end of the call, as the operator confirmed that help was on the way, Kathy said something in Cantonese, a few words addressed directly to her husband. She was pleading with Robert not to leave her alone in that house. Robert left anyway, and he walked out to fetch the Lin grandparents, alone, calm, composed, leaving his wife at the scene of the worst thing either of them had ever witnessed. He moved, investigators would later note, like a man who already knew there was nothing left to fear inside that house. The first responders. Police and paramedics arrived within minutes. What they encountered was immediately described by veteran officers as among the most disturbing crime scenes they had ever witnessed. 5 people, every room on the second floor. Blood on surfaces no one expects to find blood. The Lin family, Min, Yun, Irene, Henry, and Terry, were all confirmed dead at the scene. No survivors, no weapon, no fingerprints, no foreign DNA. The investigation into the Lin family massacre had officially begun. And it would take years before the man who had walked out of that house and driven calmly to collect the grandparents would finally be made to answer for what he had done. There is a particular cruelty embedded in cases where the perpetrator is hiding in plain sight, where they attend the funeral, comfort the grieving, manage the estate, and tuck the surviving child into bed at night, all while investigators work themselves to exhaustion, searching for a monster they cannot yet name. That was the reality of the Lin family murder investigation, one of the longest, most complex, and most emotionally draining criminal investigations in New South Wales history. It would take nearly 2 years to make an arrest, and another 6 years beyond that before a final verdict was delivered. But the truth, as it always does, eventually found its way into the light. The early investigation, no leads, no suspects. In the immediate aftermath of the discovery on July 18, 2009, detectives from the NSW Homicide Squad descended on Boundary Road, North Epping. The crime scene was processed with extraordinary care, photographed, documented, and analyzed over multiple days. Every surface was examined. Every blood stain was mapped. Every shoe print was recorded and measured. What investigators found was both extensive and frustratingly incomplete. The shoe prints, size 9.5 with a distinctive ornate tread pattern, were present in every room where a murder had occurred, tracking through blood and across floorboards with a consistency that told investigators one critical thing. A single person had moved through this house systematically, room by room, with deliberate purpose. This was not chaos. This was not a robbery interrupted. This was a plan, executed, but there was no weapon, no foreign fingerprints, no foreign DNA, no surveillance footage capturing anyone approaching the house. The front door had not been forced. The killer had entered cleanly, moved cleanly, and departed cleanly. Every avenue of traditional forensic inquiry led to the same wall. The community reacted with a grief that was difficult to contain. North Epping was a quiet, safe suburb. The kind of place where people left doors unlocked and children walked to school alone. The idea that 5 members of a single family had been massacred in their beds shattered that sense of security completely. Vigils were held. Flowers accumulated outside the house on Boundary Road. The local Chinese-Australian community, of which the Lins had been beloved members, gathered in collective mourning and collective bewilderment. Who could have done this, and why? Theories and dead ends. In the absence of concrete evidence, investigators and media alike explored every possible theory. The Lin news agency had been burglarized months before the murders, a fact that initially suggested organized criminal involvement. Min had also reportedly witnessed an armored car robbery in the week before his death, sparking speculation that he had been silenced as a potential witness. There were whispered theories about Chinese organized crime, about business disputes, about debts unknown to the family's public profile. None of these theories held. The crime scene itself argued powerfully against robbery as a motive. Money and valuables had been left completely untouched. The power had been deliberately cut, suggesting intimate knowledge of the house. The killer had known that Brenda was away, evidenced by the clean, untouched door handle on her bedroom. This was personal. This was targeted. This was someone who had been inside that house before, who knew its layout, its routines, and its occupants. Investigators began looking closer to home. The emergency call. A hidden clue months into the investigation, with no suspects formally identified. A detective made the decision to listen, again for what felt like the 100th time, to Kathy's emergency call from the morning of the discovery. He listened past the screaming, past the sobs, past the fractured, desperate attempts to explain what she had found. And at the very end of the recording, as the operator confirmed that help was on its way, he heard something that had been overlooked in every previous review. Kathy, in her distress, had switched briefly into Cantonese and addressed her husband directly. She was pleading with Robert not to leave her alone in that house. And Robert had left anyway. The translated words hit investigators with immediate force. 5 people had just been murdered inside that building. The killer was potentially still on the premises. Any person with a normal, innocent response to that situation would have stayed with their spouse, would have held them, shielded them, refused to leave them alone in a house where something incomprehensibly violent had just occurred. Robert had simply walked out, calm, purposeful, alone, because he already knew with absolute certainty that there was nothing left to fear inside that house, where Robert Thaptinthi emerges as the primary suspect. As investigators began focusing on Robert Tsai, details that had previously seemed unremarkable suddenly acquired new weight. He had a key to the Lin family home, a key that Min had given him in trust, and that Robert had never mentioned during any interrogation. It was Brenda who revealed this during one of her own sessions with investigators, an unwitting disclosure that became one of the most important single facts in the entire case. Robert's background was re-examined with fresh scrutiny. His claim of being a successful ENT doctor in China did not withstand investigation. His professional history was unstable. Allegations of bribery had reportedly followed him from China. In Australia, every business venture had failed. He was unemployed, financially dependent, and living in the shadow of a brother-in-law who had built the kind of life Robert believed was rightfully his. Once the guardianship of Brenda was formalized and the Lin estate came under his and Kathy's management, Robert's behavior shifted in ways that alarmed those paying attention. He moved to have Yoon's parents removed from the house that Min had purchased for them. He began actively reviewing bank accounts, real estate holdings, and business assets, conducting himself, witnesses noted, less like a grieving relative and more like a man who had just inherited a fortune and was eager to take stock of it. the shoebox. The breakthrough investigators obtained permission to install hidden surveillance cameras inside the Z household. They did not have to wait long for a return on that decision. During one recorded session, Robert C. was captured on camera doing something that required no interpretation. He was meticulously destroying a shoebox. Carefully, methodically. The way a person destroys something they cannot afford to have found. A subsequent conversation with Kathy during a separate interrogation provided the context that made the footage devastating. Kathy mentioned, without apparent awareness of its significance, that Robert had purchased 2 pairs of a particular brand of limited edition sneakers some years earlier. He had worn 1 pair out and discarded them. The second pair, still in its box, had been carefully stored at home. Robert wore size 9.5 shoes. A search warrant was executed on the C home. Investigators found a new pair of size 9.5 sneakers, and the tread pattern on their soles matched with forensic precision. The bloody shoe prints photographed in every room of the Lin family home on the morning of July 18, 2009. In the garage, forensic investigators found something else. A small, smeared mark. Easy to miss, easy to dismiss, that tested positive for human blood. DNA analysis confirmed that the blood sample contained the genetic material of all 5 Lin family victims, every single one of them, in Robert Z.'s garage, literally connecting him through the blood of his victims to the crime scene he had worked so carefully to leave clean. Arrest May 2011. In May 2011, nearly 2 years after the murders, Robert Sy was arrested. He denied everything. The blood in the garage, he claimed, had been transferred there after he and Kathy visited the Lin home, following the discovery of the bodies. The sneakers, he insisted, were brand new. He had thrown the old pair away immediately. His explanations were calm, detailed, and entirely unconvincing to investigators who had spent 2 years building the case against him. Trial, confession, and verdict. Robert's trial was one of the longest and most complex in New South Wales legal history. He sat through proceedings with the same composed, unreadable expression he had worn throughout the investigation. The evidence against him was significant, but largely circumstantial. The shoe prints, the blood trace, the key, the behavior. The jury, after extended deliberation, could not reach a unanimous verdict. Robert was released on bail in December 2015. The case was retried. And in June 2016, during the resumed proceedings, a new witness came forward. A prison informant who testified that Robert had confessed to something beyond the murders themselves. He had described, this witness said, an obsession with Brenda that had begun when she was just 13 years old. Brenda was recalled, and in a courtroom before a judge and jury, she tearfully confirmed what she had carried in silence since moving into the C household after her family's deaths. Robert had coerced her into a sexual relationship in the period following the murders, when she was a grieving teenager living under his roof and entirely dependent on him for shelter, stability, and survival. She had said nothing for years because she was afraid and because she had nowhere else to go. The jury returned its verdict in March 2017. Robert C. was found guilty on all 5 counts of murder. He was sentenced to 5 consecutive life sentences, 1 for each person he had killed, with no possibility of parole. Every subsequent appeal was rejected. In the courtroom, as the verdict was read, Brenda Lin sat with her hands folded in her lap. She had waited nearly 8 years for this moment. She had survived the unsurvivable, the murder of her entire family, years of abuse at the hands of the man who killed them, and a legal process that had stretched across most of her teenage years and young adulthood. She did not celebrate. She simply sat and breathed and allowed herself, perhaps for the first time in years, to believe that it was finally over. There is a particular kind of grief that does not announce itself loudly. It does not arrive in a single wave and then recede. It moves into a person the way water moves into stone. Slowly, persistently, finding every crack, reshaping everything from the inside until the person standing on the other side of it is both the same and irrevocably different. Brenda Lynn knows this kind of grief better than almost anyone alive. She lost her father, her mother, her aunt, and her two younger brothers in a single night. She then spent years living under the roof of the man who killed them, not knowing what he had done, while he managed her inheritance and violated her trust in ways that compounded the original devastation into something almost beyond language. And then she sat in a courtroom and told the truth. And then she waited for the world to decide if it believed her. It did. And now she lives with all of it: the loss, the survival, and the strange and heavy burden of being the one who remained. Brenda Lynn, the survivor. Brenda Lynn was 15 years old when her family was murdered. She is a young woman in her early 30s now, a person who has lived more than half her life in the aftermath of that single night in July 2009. She has spoken sparingly and selectively to media over the years, which is entirely her right. What is known is that she pursued her education with the same quiet determination that characterized her parents. She did not allow the years of trauma, legal proceedings, and public scrutiny to permanently derail the future her mother and father had sacrificed so much to provide for her. The road was not straightforward. The years immediately following the murders placed Brenda in an almost unimaginably difficult position: grieving, dependent, orphan, and living with the man who had destroyed her family while simultaneously being subjected to his abuse. That she survived this period, that she eventually found the courage to speak the truth in a courtroom, and that she continued building a life beyond it speaks to a resilience that those who knew her parents would likely recognize. She carries Min and Yoon in her, their discipline, their determination, their refusal to be defeated by circumstance. Brenda has largely retreated from public life, which investigators, advocates, and those who followed the case closely have respected and supported. She deserves, more than almost anyone, the ordinary privacy of an ordinary life. The grandparents and extended family, the Lin family grandparents, both sets, in Min's parents and Yoon's parents, endured losses that are difficult to fully comprehend. They had emigrated to Australia to be close to their children and grandchildren. They had built their retirement around proximity to a family that no longer existed. Min's parents lost their son. Yoon's parents lost their daughter, their other daughter Irene, and two grandsons, essentially their entire Australian family, erased in a single night by a man they had welcomed as a relative. Robert C.'s attempt to remove Yoon's parents from the home Min had purchased for them, a move he made in the period when he held guardianship over Brenda and effective control over the estate, added a layer of cruelty to their suffering that the community did not forget. The matter was eventually resolved, and the elderly couple were able to remain in the home. But the fact that a man who had just murdered their daughter and grandchildren then attempted to dispossess them of their housing stands as one of the most revealing illustrations of Robert C.'s character on record. Kathy Z., Robert's wife and Min's sister, occupies perhaps the most complicated position of anyone connected to this case. She lost her brother, her sister-in-law, her nephews, and her niece. She then learned that the man she had built her life with was responsible. She had been drugged by him on the night of the murders to prevent her from noticing his absence. She had unknowingly provided investigators with the crucial detail about the shoes that helped break the case. She was, in every meaningful sense, also one of Robert's victims, a woman whose life was hollowed out by his actions. that her journey toward any kind of healing has been her own, conducted largely away from public view, and deserves to be treated with corresponding respect. The community of North Epping, the suburb of North Epping, changed after July 18, 2009. Not dramatically, not visibly. The streets remained quiet. The gardens remained tended. The children continued attending the same schools. But the people who lived there during that period carry the memory of it differently now. The house on Boundary Road, once associated with a warm and generous family, became a landmark of tragedy. Neighbors who remembered Min waving from the driveway, Yun bringing food to community events, Henry and Terry kicking a soccer ball in the yard. They speak of the family with the particular tenderness reserved for people taken too soon and too violently. In the local Chinese-Australian community, which had embraced the Lins as exemplary members, was shaken in ways that extended beyond grief into a more complicated reckoning. The murders had been committed not by a stranger, not by a random act of urban violence, but by someone embedded within the community itself, someone who had used the bonds of family and trust as weapons. That knowledge complicated the mourning and made the healing slower and more uncertain. Community members established informal memorials. There were calls, in the years following the verdict, for greater awareness around financial abuse within families, around the vulnerability of migrant communities to exploitation by those closest to them, and around the particular dangers faced by children who are placed in the care of guardians with undisclosed motives. The legal and social impact. The Lin family case had measurable effects on how Australian law and social services approach several intersecting issues. The case highlighted critical gaps in the guardianship system, specifically the ease with which Robert C. was able to position himself as Brenda's legal guardian and assume control of the Lin estate with relatively limited scrutiny. In the aftermath of the verdict, advocates for child protection and estate law reform pointed to the case as a clear example of how existing frameworks could be exploited by individuals with concealed motives. The case also contributed to broader conversations about domestic and family violence within migrant communities, about the cultural pressures that can make it difficult for victims to report abuse, about the isolation that can result from being far from one's original support networks, and about the particular vulnerability of children who have lost their primary protectors and are placed in the care of those whose trustworthiness has not been independently verified. The New South Wales Homicide Squad's handling of the case, particularly the patience, aced, and persistence required to build a case over nearly 2 years before making an arrest, and the decision to install surveillance equipment that ultimately produced the critical evidence, has been studied as an example of long-form investigative methodology in cases where forensic evidence alone is insufficient. The willingness of investigators to return repeatedly to existing materials, including Kathy's emergency call, which had been reviewed many times before the Cantonese detail was finally caught and translated, is now cited in discussions of investigative thoroughness. Where is Robert Tipinth today? Robert Sy is currently serving 5 consecutive life sentences in a New South Wales correctional facility with no possibility of parole. Every appeal he has lodged since his conviction in March 2017 has been rejected by the courts. He has continued, by all available accounts, to maintain his innocence publicly, a position entirely inconsistent with the confessions he made to multiple prison informants, the forensic evidence connecting him to the crime scene, and the testimony of the surviving victim whose life he shattered twice over. He will die in prison. The 5 people he killed in that house on Boundary Road on the night of July 17th into July 18th. But 2009 will never have the opportunity to grow old. Min Lin will never see his daughter become the woman she has worked so hard to be. Yun Lin will never sit at another family dinner. never hear her boys argue over a soccer match, never hold a grandchild. Henry Lynn, who was 12 years old and had a whole life constructed entirely of possibility, will never play another game. Terry Lynn, who was 9, will never grow up. Irene, who came to Australia to be close to her sister, died in what should have been the safety of family. Robert C. has never expressed remorse. The courts have made clear he never will be free. Final tribute. For the Lynn family. There is a version of the Lynn family story that should have been told differently. It should have been the story of a man who arrived in Australia with nothing and built something extraordinary. A business, a home, a family, a community. It should have been the story of a woman who raised 3 remarkable children while holding a household together with love and discipline and an open door for anyone who needed it. It should have been the story of a little girl who grew up to be a doctor, a teacher, an artist, whatever she chose, and of 2 boys who grew tall and loud and passionate about soccer and eventually became men their parents were proud of. It should have been the story of a family that proved, as so many migrant families do, that it is possible to build a beautiful life in a foreign country through nothing more than hard work, love, and the willingness to show up every single day. Instead, it became a story about what envy and greed and the absence of conscience can destroy. It became a story about betrayal at its most fundamental. The betrayal of trust, of family, of the basic human contract that says we do not harm those who open their doors to us. But here is what must also be said, and said clearly. The Lynn family was not defined by how they died. They were defined by how they lived, by the business Min built from a newsstand into something remarkable, by the home Yun created with warmth and generosity, by the way Irene devoted herself to children she loved as her own, by the laughter of 2 boys who loved soccer and each other, by the quiet courage of a 15-year-old girl who went on a school trip and came home to devastation and somehow, impossibly, kept going. Brenda Lynn kept going. She is still going. In Khan and in her survival, in her testimony, in her refusal to be permanently destroyed by what was done to her and to the people she loved, she honors all of them. Her father, her mother, her aunt, her brothers, in the most profound way available to her. She carries them forward into whatever comes next. Their names were Min Lin, Yun Lin, Irene, Henry Lin, and Terry Lin. They were a family. They were loved. They were building something beautiful. They deserved every year that was taken from them, and the world is immeasurably poorer for their absence.